Good morning, everyone. We are very pleased that you could join us today for our informed webinar. I'm Glenn Russell. I'm with the R&D department here at CableLabs, and I'm delighted to be your host and your moderator for today's program entitled Energy Efficiency Through Industry Action. Over the last 5 years, the North American communications and consumer technology industries have been working to reduce the amount of energy required to consume entertainment content and new communication services. Through highly successful voluntary agreements, service providers and manufacturers have enabled consumer and environmental benefits in a rapid and flexible manner. The approach serves as a model for how private efforts can drive sustainability and meet regional and national policy goals. Today, we'll present the details of these voluntary agreements and demonstrate how collaborative, industry-led initiatives lead to significant consumer savings, innovative new features, and a cleaner environment. In terms of the formal agenda for today's webinar, we have about 45 minutes of presentation and content, and that's going to include some question and answer segments that are built into the webinar. After the presentations, we'll finish up with a brief recap of some upcoming events on the CableLabs calendar. And please note that the presentation slides for today's webinar are available to you right now. If you look at your GoToWebinar toolbar, a PDF file can be found in the handout section of the software. You can click on that link and download the PDF presentation. And this is great because there are a number of links in the presentation, so having access to the PDF file should help you. Our expert panel today consists of 3 speakers: Debbie Fitzgerald, Director of Technology Policy at CableLabs, Mark Hess, Senior Vice President at Comcast, and Doug Johnson, Vice President at the Consumer Technology Association. Debbie's going to start us off, and she'll provide an overview of the drive towards energy efficiency and where we are today. Mark will follow. He'll provide his valuable perspective on the evolution of products and network architectures. And Doug will close, discussing the benefits of voluntary agreements to consumers. And if you'd like to ask a question of any of our speakers today, please use your GoToWebinar software toolbar. You'll type your question in, we'll receive it, and we'll take a couple of breaks along the way to field what you submit. And we do value the interaction, so please take us up on this offer. So now it's time to get started. I'm going to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Debbie Fitzgerald. Debbie?
Thanks, Glenn. The communications industry is at the forefront of technological innovation, enabling connectivity and entertainment for millions of consumers around the globe. One important mechanism for driving sustainability is concerted industry action to reduce energy usage of its widely deployed devices. This includes the SetTop Box Voluntary Agreement, which covers set-top boxes that service providers provide to customers to receive and view their video content, and the Small Network Equipment Voluntary Agreement, which covers devices like cable and DSL modems, Wi-Fi routers, and integrated devices that combine a modem, a Wi-Fi router, and a phone service. Canada has a similar initiative known as SEVA that covers set-top boxes, modeled after the U.S. Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement. Before we dive into the details of the VAs, I thought I would provide a bit of history. Back in 2011, NRDC issued a report that claimed that set-top boxes used more energy than refrigerators. Needless to say, this got the attention of the regulators, and DOE began going down the path of standing up regulation. In late 2012, the major U.S. pay TV providers joined manufacturers and trade associations to establish the Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement, and in 2013, the VA was expanded and added energy efficiency advocacy organizations, NRDC and ACEEE, as signatories. At this point, DOE publicly terminated their proceedings, and Secretary of Energy at the time, Ernest Moniz, praised the industry effort. Part of the advocates' ask when joining the Set-Top Box VA in 2013 was to explore a similar agreement for small network equipment, and this was established in 2015. And then in Canada, at the beginning of last year, the pay TV industry established an agreement known as SEVA, which is modeled after the US VA and also includes NRCan on the steering committee. And finally, this year, the set-top box and small network equipment VAs, the original terms ended, but Due to their success, they were both renewed this year to run through 2021 with a final report to be published in 2022. Both of these VA renewals also defined new, more stringent tiers of energy allowances for the devices. The U.S. Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement includes all the major service providers as signatories, serving 84.5 million U.S. video subscribers and covers over 93% of the pay TV market in the U.S. It also includes manufacturers Eros, EchoStar Technologies, and Technicolor, and as I mentioned before, the energy advocacy organizations NRDC and ACEEE. The U.S. Small Network Equipment Voluntary Agreement includes the largest residential broadband service providers, serving nearly 95 million subscribers, and this covers over 89% of the market. The service providers are largely similar to the Set-Top Box VA, and there are a number of additional manufacturer signatories, as you can see here. And the CEVA agreement in Canada includes the signatories you see listed here, serving 9.5 million subscribers, and that covers about 86% of the Canadian pay TV market. As I mentioned before, although not an official signatory, NRCan, the Department of Natural Resources Canada, which is similar to the Department of Energy here in the US, was very involved in the discussions leading up to the CEVA agreement and is also officially on the CEVA steering committee. There are some general commitments that are similar across all three voluntary agreements. The primary commitment is that 90% of all newly purchased devices will have energy consumption that meets or comes in lower than the applicable tier allowances. All of the VAs have an independent administrator that collects confidential procurement reports, identifies any signatories who are not compliant with the 90% commitment, and handles the remediation process. The independent administrator also produces the annual reports. Each VA has mechanisms to audit and verify the testing and reporting of the device energy consumption. Over the last 4 years of the Set-Top Box VA, it even included a field verification activity where an independent test organization went out into between 80 and 100 customers' homes across the US to test set-top boxes in a real deployment scenario. Over the 4 years, the results were really close to what the signatories reported. So the renewed Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement is going forward with a laboratory audit approach. Each year, one randomly selected signatory's procurement report is also audited, and all three of the VAs include a requirement to make the energy consumption of their devices publicly available, which can be found on the service provider's websites or through the VA website, and we'll share links to the VA websites later in the presentation. The implementation of these commitments has been immensely successful. This chart here shows the energy savings due to the U.S. Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement for each year of the Set-Top Box VA. These savings are compared to baseline levels that were established with the advocates back in 2012. The most recent independent aggregator report just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it reported that in 2017 alone, the U.S. Set-Top Box Voluntary Agreement has saved 11 terawatt hours of energy. To put those savings into context, 11 terawatt hours of energy in 2017 equates to saving U.S. customers $1.4 billion. It also avoided 8.1 million metric tons of CO2 by not needing to produce those 11 terawatt hours of energy. And over the full 5 years of the VA saved a total of 27.8 terawatt hours of energy, which equates to $3.5 billion back in consumers' pockets and avoiding 20.6 million metric tons of CO2. And this 11 terawatt hours of energy essentially eliminates the need for nearly 4 power plants a year. On the S&E front, small network equipment has been evolving at a rapid pace, increasing network speeds from the service providers to the home, and also increasing the network capability within the home. Many of the newer products integrate multiple functionalities that have been supported with separate devices, such as broadband modem functionality, high-speed Wi-Fi, multi-port routing, and Internet of Things controllers. Although the broadband performance has grown rapidly over the years, the energy consumption of small network equipment devices has actually decreased relative to the broadband speeds. And this is depicted in the chart shown here. And the first annual report for CEVA was just released last week, and the results are already very promising. The CEVA service provider signatories were committed to purchase at least 90% of their new set-top boxes that met what are referred to as Tier 1 levels in 2017. According to the report by the independent aggregator DNR International, a full 100% of the set-top boxes met those Tier 1 levels. Now, a more stringent set of levels, known as Tier 2, went into effect for CEVA signatories in 2018, but the report also shows how many of those devices reported early compliance in 2017. And as shown in this chart, 86.4% of the units purchased also met those more stringent Tier 2 levels. This is an indication that the CEVA signatories are well on their way to meet the Tier 2 requirements for 2018. I should mention that these Tier 1 and Tier 2 schedule of allowances are the same for US and Canada, which is important because the markets and the systems are very similar, as well as the manufacturers. In the US VA, Tier 1 was in effect from 2014 through 2016, and Tier 2 went into effect in 2017. So CEVA is just 1 year behind, with Tier 2 going into effect in 2018. Okay, so Glenn, I've covered quite a bit of ground here. We can pause for questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Debbie. Debbie, great overview of the history of voluntary agreements and as well as their impact that they're having today. So let's dig into some audience questions. If you're late joining us, how you ask questions of our speakers today is you type them in and we'll field them as we get them. First question, what are some trends and methods of device energy savings?
So energy savings in these devices comes from a number of areas. One of the trends that we often see in devices is that early generations will consume more energy initially because features and capabilities are kind of tacked on as hardware modules in the early phases, but then subsequent generations will have features more integrated into the SoCs and the hardware, and that results in energy savings. Energy efficiency is important in all phases of design and development, from the chip level to the hardware design, to the firmware and the middleware and the application layers of the software. And, you know, it's also even important to consider energy efficiency in the interface protocol design. And you know, for those of you who are familiar with DOCSIS 3.1, the DOCSIS light sleep is a perfect example of how energy efficiency was considered even at the spec and protocol phase.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Next question is, how do voluntary agreements compare to Energy Star?
Oh, that's a great question. So this actually confuses a lot of people because this is not Energy Star. Energy Star is a program that is ultimately more focused on consumer products. However, the two programs are actually really similar in their technical approaches. They both have a set of allowances that are established based on product features, and even the nomenclature and the test procedures are mostly aligned. However, Energy Star is focused on targeting the top 25% of the market, whereas the VAs have a 90% commitment. Energy Star also doesn't collect procurement data or do any aggregate reporting like the VAs. And honestly, for set-top boxes and small network equipment, Energy Star just doesn't have the same level of industry engagement as the VAs. Okay,
great. And what about Roku and Apple TV boxes? How do they fit in? Are they included in these programs?
So in the case of those types of devices, those are considered what we call customer owned and managed devices. COAM is what we call them. And they're actually not within scope of the voluntary agreements. This covers the set-top boxes that are leased or provided by the service provider.
Okay, thanks. Debbie, we're getting a bunch of questions here, but I think it's probably prudent that we move on because we've got two more great speakers ahead. At this time, my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, and that's Mark Hess, Senior Vice President at Comcast. Take it away, Mark.
Thanks, Glenn. Debbie asked me to join this webinar to provide the perspective of an operator. And, you know, Comcast has a strong commitment to sustainability and corporate responsibility, and really, really pleased to be part of these efforts. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a special thanks to Debbie and CableLabs. Without their support, a lot of this work just couldn't get done. And also a quick shout out to some of my teammates here, Benny Pruden, Daniel Singer, and Albert Garcia, who do a lot of the work. And one thing I wanted to make sure people realize is, while this is about set-top boxes and small network equipment, and that's really important because those are devices we choose to put into the customer's home, but the customers actually pay for the electricity. The SCTE has a broad effort called Energy 2020 and it's as depicted in this chart. We're working together to reduce energy consumption in data centers, head ends, in the access network itself, and across the operations, even focusing on fleet vehicle reduction. So it's important that we're actually working on other areas as well. And I encourage you to contact the SCTE if you're interested to learn more about that or even joining those efforts. What I really want to walk through mostly here is how the architecture in our homes and how the evolution of that architecture is also significantly impacting energy savings. I mean, Debbie took you through the accomplishments to date, but there's other things we're doing, and I wanted to make sure we highlight those. So I'm going to go through kind of the evolution of home architectures in, let's say, a typical 3-room home and compare consumption of those different architectures. So if you look at the legacy video services, and just going back a few years, really when DVRs were first introduced, you needed a DVR on every single TV if you wanted the ability to record and play back. Those devices could only do 2 channels at a time. So what we've depicted here is, a customer may be taking 2 DVRs so they could have at least access in 2 rooms, and then maybe in their 3rd room didn't have a DVR, although many times some people did. So you can see there that the energy consumption is pretty significant, 712 kilowatt hours a year. Going forward to the next slide, we see most operators, both satellite and landline operators, cable and phone, went to really a whole home approach. So you needed only 1 DVR, and then you had client boxes sharing that the QAM tuners in the single DVR. So now you have whole home. This is great because now I can have DVR on every set-top, and even more important, I can have all my recordings in every room as opposed to only some recordings in one room and some recordings in another room. And now you can see, well, that's pretty good. We went from over 700 to just over 318 kilowatt hours a year. If you go to the next architecture, we're really down to no spinning discs in the home, no DVR in the home, because we're now using cloud DVR. This is something Comcast is deploying. Cablevision, and now Altice was the first company to deploy that. Kudos to them, blazing the trails. But you can see yet again, reduced energy to 243 kilowatt hours per year. And now, if you go to the next architecture, now we're talking about no set-top, no video set-top as a main gateway in the home, because now you've got all IP delivery, and now the QAM set-top is gone entirely. We're going right from the gateway to the client devices, and that's all being done via Wi-Fi. And all of a sudden, we're down to 168 kilowatt hours per year. So once again, significant savings, over 100 kilowatt hours per year by going to this evolution. And then finally, we're beginning to do a lot of work around applications onto smart televisions themselves. While this is still early stages, and with an HTML5 app, the partner TV program that Comcast has put out there, televisions could have the application without a set-top at all. So in theory, and this would take some market adoption, in theory, though, you could get to 0 kilowatt hours per year for the set-top boxes in the home. So if we look at that kind of on a chart over time, that's pretty dramatic. As dramatic as the charts that Debbie showed, we're really showing that first you reduce the power consumption, then you change the architecture, and you can really, really make a difference for the consumer and in the consumer's home on how much power they need to use. And I guess I want to just emphasize again, this is the Comcast X1 DVR power consumption This is a QAM video and I want to emphasize a little bit that our manufacturing partners, Aris and Technicolor and Broadcom and Intel, have been amazing partners in helping us reduce energy over time with these devices. This chart shows our XG1 platform. This box can record up to 6 video streams. It serves live streams to the client devices. It's DOCSIS 3.0 capable, so it has a modem in there that provides our interactive guides. It provides IP video streaming of Netflix and YouTube and other applications. It provides on-demand. And as you can see, each iteration of the box, we've dropped power, and it's over 43% over time. And the next version of this also supports 4K and HEVC. So great progress on the set-top alone. Combine that with the architecture, and it's a really amazing story. I want to touch a little bit on standby power and some of the challenges around standby power, and emphasize that we continue to work in this area. It is something we agreed to experiment and work on in the agreement, and we're making strides. It's not as simple as one would think, because for a variety of reasons. First of all, the set-top is an endpoint. It terminates the network, and there's a lot going on, as I've kind of depicted in the slide here: guide data, system information, system entitlements, even the fact that having that connectivity maintained allows us to maintain the security of the device as well. So it's impossible to get that thing into a really, really deep sleep. And the other thing is our customers really expect fast start on time. They expect instant access to video. That the entitlement stream I mentioned, when you turn your television on, you want to be able to watch the channel you watch. If you subscribe to HBO and you want Game of Thrones, you want it as fast as anything else. You want your parental controls to work. You don't want to have the TV come up and have your children able to watch shows they're not supposed to watch. And, if you schedule a recording in the middle of the night, you want that recording to happen. The other thing I'd say is it causes a lot of confusion when the box comes up and it's 35, 40, 50 seconds before it gets to video. Customers hit other buttons and cause issues, or it might even lead to a truck roll. And truck rolls, by their nature, consume a lot of energy as well and impact our carbon footprint in a big way. So avoiding truck rolls is important as anything else. So that's an important part of this. The other thing I'd emphasize, if you look at a little bubble, as we go to that all IP architecture, it's much easier to put those devices into a standby power with a 40% reduction in power when they are in standby power. So going forward, that standby power will be easier to do and as sustainable. I want to touch too on for us, it's Xfinity Stream. Almost every operator has some type of application they're putting onto smart devices. And whether that's an Apple, Android smartphone or tablet, it could be Roku, it could be a laptop, it could be a smart television. It's really, the world's changing. I mean, the way I like to think it is every screen now that can do video is a television in a sense, whether it's a small screen or a big screen. And people are using them. The emphasis I put here is the most recent report we put out. Consumers used 103 million unique customer-owned and managed devices to access our video services in 2017. And you compare that to the estimated 207 million set-tops we have, you can see that customers are really watching video on all types of devices. So going forward, the fact that they're watching on these other types of screens is saving energy as well. So last, to wrap up and summarize a little bit, I think it's really important to point out that there's not only benefits to customers, and Doug's going to get into that a little more, but these voluntary agreements have allowed us to intelligently blend creation of new features, for example, ultra-high def or high efficiency processing, or as I mentioned, the DOCSIS capabilities, putting new features into set-top boxes, but also reducing power. And a lot of times in regulatory environments, that doesn't happen. You really are stymied on the innovation side of this. So as we dream up cool services, but also work on lowering the device energy consumption, which reduces truck rolls and everything else, it's really good. So less power means more stability in the boxes, more innovation. So this is a virtuous circle in a sense. So we keep going on that. So with that, Glenn, I think I've hit on all my points. Hopefully people are take away how this is working for an operator, and we'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Mark. Fantastic overview on the progress that you and other operators are making in this area. Let's dig right in. Everything's moving to the cloud these days. So what are your thoughts on how cloud services and cloud architectures help energy efficiency?
Well, it reduces the complexity of the devices in the home, and therefore that lowers the energy required to operate those devices. For example, our RX1 guide is really a cloud service. Cloud DVR obviously is a cloud service. And that helped enable our all IP rollout, which even further reduces the requirements of the devices in the home.
Okay, great, thanks. And some of the energy reduction savings that you're seeing, do you think these would have happened naturally without the voluntary agreements?
Well, I think every cycle of a tech product, there's natural improvements in this area, and that goes along with innovation. But the point of the VA is to take an organized approach to that and to accelerate that and to reach new savings opportunities with products categories as they move forward, but still protecting that innovation and allowing us all to compete. That avoids some of the pitfalls of what traditional regulation would do. I think the other thing is, as I meet with manufacturers, they're very aware of these agreements, and as new entrants in the space, they want to participate, and that way it's in the forefront of the minds of the designers, the engineers, the system architects that work for all our vendors. So I think it really has made a big difference having this voluntary agreement in place.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Hey, Mark, we might come back to you with some more questions at the end, but now let's first hear from Doug Johnson from the CTA with some of his thoughts on benefits to consumers. So we'll turn it over to you now, Doug.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you again, CableLabs, for inviting us to present as part of this webinar this morning. The Consumer Technology Association is a trade association. We have members across the spectrum of the consumer tech industry, including service providers and device manufacturers, software companies, component suppliers, retailers, etc. So the whole value chain, and many of these players have either directly or indirectly been involved in one or more of the voluntary agreements that Debbie summarized at the beginning of this webinar. We have a real focus at the association, as our members do individually, on sustainability and energy efficiency as part of that, of course. These voluntary agreements really, to me, represent a third way of supporting and advancing energy efficiency in the tech sector, or in general. It could be for other sectors, but certainly for ours, it has special meaning. I'll get into that in a couple of ways. There are a couple of dimensions to this to the concept of voluntary agreements that I want to highlight. And then, of course, as Mark mentioned, I want to underscore what this means ultimately for the consumer and the general public. Consensus standards, that is industry consensus standards, are actually one of the building blocks. It's something we do at CTA as an association. But as this slide illustrates, there are a couple of key standards that give us standardized ways to measure power consumption, which obviously you have to have if you're going to have any sort of policy or program related to energy efficiency in a product category. So our members and other stakeholders in and outside of the industry, including government advocates, have been a part of the standards development process that, again, is a building block or component of the voluntary agreements and other policies concerning energy efficiency. Really, what makes a voluntary agreement successful, in fact, what also helped the voluntary agreement reach the status of an award-winning program a couple of years ago, as you see in this slide, are several characteristics that I wanted to highlight briefly here. It begins with an industry commitment. As Mark mentioned a moment ago, the VA is an organized process to achieve a goal that really nowadays is a shared goal between industry advocates and government. That is to reduce power consumption in various product categories across various industry sectors, which in turn, of course, reduces carbon emissions associated with that power consumption. It begins with companies interested and willing to come together, intense competitors in some cases willing to come together under the umbrella of a voluntary agreement to accomplish this task. Importantly, for our members, Mark's company, and everybody who's a signatory to these agreements is the flexibility to innovate. By whatever approach we take as an industry, we really have to protect innovation and competition. It's the lifeblood of our industry. And we've done that in several ways with this agreement. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Transparency is a characteristic that is important, especially to policymakers that are watching these agreements unfold, and energy efficiency advocates, which in some cases are directly involved in these. But much like a traditional regulatory program, if we're going to take a non-regulatory approach in the form of a VA, we need to be transparent about what it is and how it's going and report that progress to the public. As part of the success of this agreement, we've also involved an independent administrator overseeing these agreements to, again, give the initiative further credibility. As I referenced a moment ago, this is ultimately a partnership or a collaboration amongst various parties, including industry, government, and advocates. It is actually the time span of these agreements shows we've bridged from one administration at the federal level in the U.S. to another without any sort of disruption. This is a private sector initiative. It's not dependent on government funding or the agenda of a current or former administration. It's really something that's appreciated by policymakers across governments ultimately, but we're not dependent on the vagaries of policy preferences from one administration to another. It's something that we can keep going over the years, as these agreements have done so far. The new Features Allowance process is that example I wanted to provide you about how we protect innovation in these agreements. Companies in the pay TV and broadband sectors are constantly innovating, as you can imagine, with their products in response to changes in technology, competition, demands from consumers. And to protect and enable that, we built into the voluntary agreements a new features process to encourage that innovation and competition, and also enable energy efficiency by design at the product design level. I like this slide because it really shows what's particularly advantageous about taking this type of an approach, this type of non-regulatory voluntary agreement approach over traditional regulation, which has its own timelines and obligations. Had the Department of Energy, I think Debbie in her presentation mentioned the origin of the voluntary agreement, but at one time back in 2012, the U.S. Department of Energy was considering a traditional regulation for limiting the energy use of set-top boxes. And had they finalized that in 2012, it wouldn't have been until about 5 years later that they could have made that regulation effective in the marketplace. And if you look at this slide, you realize, well, gee whiz, over that span of time, we've been able to save almost 30 terawatt hours of electricity and deliver those benefits to the public. This sort of an agreement enables faster delivery of savings to meet those goals that, again, are shared by policymakers and industry when it comes to reducing our environmental impact. The concept of a voluntary agreement is not particular to North America. It's actually part of a global trend. I wanted to mention that briefly here, but we've seen reflection of this concept in Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. We've seen it in the European Union, actually in several product categories, as you see named on that slide. So it is essentially, as I said before, a third way of going about energy efficiency policy. The first, as I mentioned, is traditional regulation, which is usually something that's applied to the appliance or white goods space. Energy Star, as Debbie mentioned, is an existing program, been around for a quarter of a century and successful in its own right, but different than what we're doing with the voluntary agreements in a couple of ways. And now we have voluntary agreements as really a third way and arguably a very effective and significant policy option in particular categories across the tech industry. The next slide I wanted to highlight, because we're now driving toward the ultimate benefits for consumers, whether they realize them or not, but it's something we like to quantify and highlight. And what this slide illustrates is the annual energy cost of various appliances and products in the home, including a few electronic products categories, which you see on the left-hand side. Electronics fare pretty well across the spectrum of products here, but driving those annual operating costs down to the teens and below is accomplished through innovation and voluntary programs and these voluntary agreements. The numbers speak for themselves, but these are savings to the consumer ultimately in terms of dollars. Sometimes it's easier for consumers to grasp the dollar figure than the kilowatt hour figure, but it's great savings, and it's a great savings story from these initiatives. One of the last slides I want to show here summarizes the the benefits, I think, that are the highlights coming out of voluntary agreements. As I mentioned, saving money for consumers, that's certainly a welcome achievement. Promoting product innovation, enabling that, facilitating it, protecting it is something we need to incorporate and have in such initiatives. That slide I showed about the savings achieved during the time it would have taken the regulation to develop and roll out to market, it just underscores how we can deliver and meet those goals faster than traditional regulation under a flexible approach such as a voluntary agreement. And of course, in the end, we're, from a policy standpoint, talking about something that benefits the environment, that supports sustainability, and is a great thing in that dimension as well. The resources, as part of the transparency element of these voluntary agreements, of course, are the documentation showing what they are and what they've done. And you can find in North America, anyway, on 2 websites for the U.S. and for Canada, the voluntary agreements themselves, annual reports to date. There's several for each initiative, and the signatory companies, and then, of course, links that the consumer actually may want to click on to find the power consumption of certain models provided by service providers or manufacturers in both these categories covered by a VA. So there's a lot there. It's a part of the effort, as I mentioned, about being transparent. At this point, I'm certainly ready to entertain questions, and thank you again.
Okay, great. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate that. And let's dive right in. First question we have is about our IoT future. Will IoT devices and the connected home consume more energy in the future, or do you think we can use artificial intelligence and analytics to help?
The Internet of Things, IoT, I think it's fair to say, has increased the number of powered devices in the home. Of course, some of those may be plug-in, others may be battery operated, but it certainly increases the number of devices that require power. But at CTA, we've actually been essentially taking a census of energy use of the products, electronic products in the home over the past 12 years. About every 3 years we've done so, and our most recent census of energy use, our most recent energy use study was just done and published at the end of last year. That actually showed that the overall energy use of all these devices in our industry has decreased 25% since 2010. And that's even as the number of these devices, as I mentioned, has increased, in this case, 21% during that same amount of time. So we're using less power overall, even though we have more devices connected in the home. I'd also, I guess, to the point of AI, say there certainly are opportunities to capitalize on savings through the use of artificial intelligence and various IoT sensors and devices as we move forward in this industry. But knowing that the amount of connected devices is increasing, knowing the IoT trend, we thought it was all the more important to initiate that small network equipment voluntary agreement back in 2015 to try to get as much ahead of that wave with an organized approach to saving energy in the networking devices themselves.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Could you explain what happens if a service provider doesn't meet their commitments to the VA?
Yeah, good question. Under the terms of the agreement, again, you can see the agreement itself, the agreements on those websites that I highlighted at the end of the presentation. But under the terms of those agreements, if a signatory does fall short of the commitments that it signed up for, they are required to propose a remedial plan that needs to be approved by a review panel, which, by the way, also includes a representative of the energy efficiency advocacy community. And the service provider is obligated, or the signatory company is obligated, to secure even more savings through that remedial plan than the initial commitment called for. So it's a fairly stringent obligation there, and with oversight, as I mentioned, by a review panel. That type of enforcement process actually has been put to the test a couple of times already in the first 2 years of the SetTop Box Voluntary Agreement. We had 2 instances of this, one in each year, 2 different companies. And in both cases, the company had fallen short of its 90% procurement commitment, but those companies then proposed and implemented a remedial plan as called for by the agreement. And that the process is flexible so that that company can come up with creative and quick ways of achieving the needed savings. And they were able to do so in a relatively short timeline as well, really compared to traditional regulation in a way that was faster and less controversial and less costly than say, what would have been called for under a formal administrative procedure type of process under, enforcement authority by a government agency. So there's a way to make up for those savings and a way to keep the agreements moving forward.
Okay, great to know. Thanks for sharing those details with us.
Sure.
Doug, we're going to bring in Debbie and Mark for some of the final questions here. Let's start with you, Debbie. We're getting a question on Tier 1 versus Tier 2. Maybe you could explain what the two are and how much lower are Tier 2 allowances compared to Tier 1.
That's an interesting question. So in the set-top box voluntary agreement, there are actually 3 tiers defined now for the U.S. There's Tier 1 that went into effect in 2014 through 2016. Tier 2 went into effect in 2017 and runs through 2019. Tier 2 in general was about 20% more efficient than Tier 1. And then, as I mentioned, the new renewed VA that came out this year for the US set-top box VA actually defines a Tier 3 that actually trims yet another about 20% off of the Tier 2. So that's on the set-top box side of the voluntary agreement. For the Canadian Energy Efficiency VA, CEVA, right now they just have a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 defined. The same delta, though, is about 20%.
Okay, thanks for the clarification on that one. And Mark, let's bring you into the discussion here. Do the power savings from moving DVR functions from the customer premises account for the additional power for those same functions in the cloud?
Well, account for, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I mean, basically, if I move it into the cloud, you don't have the hard drive in the home, you have storage out in the cloud, and it's much easier to manage power in data centers, you're following cycles of server technology, and even following, other companies that are expert at being in running data centers. So there's a lot of, there's still power consumed, but it's a lot less on a percentage basis, and it's a lot more controllable than in the home. For example, as we talked about, it's really hard to do standby power, to put them into a standby mode in the home because of the customer's expectation. Having that type of thing centralized really makes a difference.
Okay, Debbie, we're getting questions on DOCSIS 3.1 modems here. So when will the SNEVA address these?
Actually, the renewed SNEVA that just came out this summer in July and is now posted up on that website does accommodate DOCSIS 3.1. So it accommodates DOCSIS 3.1 modems that are being deployed today. It doesn't include full duplex DOCSIS, which will be treated as a new feature allowance when that feature starts rolling out in the modems.
Okay. And that's going to have to be our final question for today, everyone. So at this point, I really want to thank our expert speakers today, Debbie Fitzgerald, Director of Technology Policy at CableLabs, Mark Hess, Senior Vice President at Comcast, and Doug Johnson, Vice President at the Consumer Technology Association. Really appreciate you guys sharing your expertise with all of us today. Thank you very much. And for the audience, we do really value your feedback on these webinars. Maybe this is your first one. Maybe you've been to several of these before. In any case, you'll receive a 1-question survey either later today or tomorrow. Please take the time to fill this out. We really value what you have to share with us, and your response will help us improve future webinars. If you have an idea for a topic for a future webinar, this is a good place to suggest it as well. A couple of great events on the upcoming CableLabs calendar. A couple of times a year, we host innovation boot camps. We have one coming up next month here in Louisville, Colorado in September. These are hosted by Phil McKinney, our CEO, and his team. And this is a great opportunity to get together with other innovators and advance your innovation practice. We'll be at the SCTE Expo in Atlanta this year. booth 173. Drop by and see us at the CableLabs booth. And more info on events that are on our upcoming calendar can be found at the link at the bottom of this slide. Finally, lots of other ways to stay informed with what's going on at CableLabs. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have a blog, and we're always publishing new materials 2-3 times a week. So CableLabs.com/blog is a great way to stay informed on a variety of technology topics. And we have an Informed Insight series, and this is for more deep dive papers and analysis. And the most recent posting is actually on the topic of this webinar today. So if you go to CableLabs.com Informed Insights, you can download a paper on energy efficiency. Thanks very much for joining us on this webinar today, and we'll see you on the next one.